Hi, I'm your host, Ryan French, and today my mother, Rebecca French, joins me on Apostolic Voice for a wonderful conversation about faith, trusting God in hard times, marriage, family, parenting, ministry, and pastoring. Mom has served as a pastor's wife for 27 years, and she's been through almost every up and down that life and ministry can bring. And in all of that, she raised 3 boys who, let's be honest, at least one of them is pretty perfect. Make sure to check out her popular article, originally featured in Reflections magazine at ryanafrench.com, called Praising the Lord in All Things. In that article, she gives a profound testimony of keeping the faith through the fire. It will bless you, so go read that as quickly as you can. This really is a great episode, so buckle up, and we'll be right back after this short break.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about Anchor. It's the easiest way to make a podcast, and best of all, it's absolutely free to get started. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple, and all the other platforms as well. It's important because it's hard to get a podcast started. I've tried in the past. It's hard to get it off the ground. It can be very complicated. Anchor does a great job of making it user-friendly and kind of keeping things in one place for you, which just helps you organize your thoughts. And as you get better and better at it, Anchor's just a great central location for you to have all your workflow. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. If you've been thinking about podcasting at all, download their free Anchor app. Just go to anchor.fm to get started. You can also find their app on Apple and Android devices. Mom, thank you so much for being on Apostolic Voice. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it, Ryan. It's some exciting things that we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. I wanted to begin just by jumping in. Last week, I talked about the issue of hurt, and in that article and in that podcast, I mentioned an article that you wrote for Apostolic Voice called Praising the Lord in All Things, a tremendous article, and really you detailed a lot of the health issues that our family had and has had over the years, which is a kind of a lot. Our family has definitely experienced, unusual levels of health issues. I think it's fair to say that.
I think so.
Yeah, my heart disease, 4 open heart surgeries. Jonathan, my middle brother, had leukemia and battled that. You've had cancer twice. And we could add a whole lot of other odd things to that list if we wanted to.
Yes.
You might mention some of those. I don't know. That's up to you. But I watched you as a young child and all throughout my adulthood keep your faith and your sanity during each one of those scary seasons of life. Not to mention all of the financial struggles and medical bills that severely hurt a young family. As a grown man now with my own family and bills, I look at the medical bills that y'all were crushed under, really, as a young couple and as young pastors in a city all by yourself, no family living close to you. I watched you handle all of that and Dad, and do it with grace and dignity and keep your faith intact. And maybe you could talk to the listeners just a little bit about how you were able to trust God in those seasons.
Well, I certainly was not the person that you thought would become a hospital mom. If you knew me in my younger years, and even as a first young married woman, I was never comfortable with the hospital situation. I really had been very protected. I hadn't experienced a lot of family members or even close church members that had ever walked through those valleys that I had walked closely with. So it was definitely an area that I didn't have any experience with. But I think one of the first things, of course, we were I was in our mid-20s and had our first child, and we had only been in the Chicago suburb of Wheaton for 5 months when you were born, and we were very excited about that. And it was only within just a few days that we were aware that we were dealing with a very, very serious congenital heart condition, tetralogy of Fallot. And I think that when I look back, I think that I had the wrong ideology, some wrong thinking that I probably had never articulated, but when faced with such a life-threatening and difficult circumstance for the first time, I think that I had this wrong idea that when you're walking in the will of God, that you kind of have bubble wrap around you. So I knew certain things. I knew that when we were going to go into that city, that we were going to make sacrifices. I knew that. And I was prepared for that. I was willing to do that.
You were probably thinking financial.
Right. Yes. That's what I was in my mind. We'll sacrifice. I'm sacrificing, as close to my family. We were hundreds of miles away. We had gone. I was a Southern girl that went north and to deal with those Chicago winters and I loved it as time went on. But I expected those things and I was prepared, but I was not prepared for that. And so I think, kind of as a child raised in the church, and you hear the story of Jonah. And Jonah suffered because he did not obey the call of God.
Right.
But we had obeyed the call of God. And so I think first I had that kind of initial thought. It kind of reminds me to jump forward when you were 5 and 5.5 and you were facing your 4th open heart surgery. And we had to sit there and tell you that we were going to have to go back in and we were going to have to isolate you for 10 days. I remember it was a Thanksgiving Day and we had to isolate because they needed to make sure that you did not get exposed to anything that could endanger you during the surgery and the recuperation. And so I remember we had to sit there and tell you, a very articulate, very bright 5.5-year-old who had vivid memories of your surgery when you were 4. And when we told you had to have that, you looked up at us and you said, but what did I do wrong? And I think that's really what I was doing to the Lord at that time. But what did we do wrong? We're in your will. But, the Lord helped us work through that and understood that bad things happen to good people, and that just because you're in the will of God, when bad things happen does not mean that you don't have the favor of God. Sometimes we can have that idea that blessings are just favor, but God works these things together for our good. And so I think that was kind of one of the first things. And so once I got through that and your dad and I worked through those things, I think some wonderful things happened that I grew in ways that I would have never grown in had I not been faced. It's one thing to pray, give us this day our daily bread, if you've never been hungry.
Yeah, that's right.
But when you're hungry, you pray it with a different fervency and intensity. And I found that my prayers, because I had never faced such difficult things, when you're praying for the life of your child and you're praying for your own emotional health and everything that goes on around you, your whole world becomes completely encompassed with these things, then your prayers take on a different meaning, and you learn to enter into a prayer realm that I had never experienced before. I wish I had. I wish I could say that I had entered into those times before, but I really hadn't. And even though I was a very sincere young woman who was willing to make sacrifices for the kingdom of God, my heart, but I learned a different level of prayer during that time.
You definitely learn how to trust God when you have to trust God, as opposed to just theoretically understanding that I need to trust God. But when you really have no choice, wouldn't you say that's true? It's like it almost forces you.
It does. You really do have a choice. You decide, will I trust God? Will I lift up mine eyes into the hills from where my help comes from? Am I going to do that? Or am I going to go the opposite way and try to get through this on my own? And, we've seen people who do that and it doesn't work. So you really have a choice. It's a crossroad. And, speaking of trust, that's another very, very memorable moment for me, a realization of trust during that time. Some things that the Lord made me aware of, that I was gifted trust. And I recognize that I was gifted trust. And that may sound like a strange thing to say, but I was raised by very godly parents, and I was raised in a very home with unconditional love. I mean, there were expectations, that we were taught. This is expectations of behavior and all that. I wasn't raised in an overindulgent home, but I was raised in a very godly home with good guidance. And my father took care of his family. He loved his family. And I knew that I could always trust my father, my earthly father. And, it's kind of like when you think of a young child and they're standing on the steps and they don't think anything about just jumping off into their dad's arms, because they know their dad's going to catch them. Well, yeah. That's the way I kind of felt in life. My dad he's there. Well, I remember one night being in the hospital. It was late at night. And it was during one of the hospitalizations for one of you boys when things was just really, really rough. And when I say a hospital mom, for those who may be listening, and there have been many hospital moms out there, but there's just it becomes a life. It's a different world. And so I had my little bag there of things that I needed to work on, and it was late, and the hospital was quieter, as quiet as a hospital gets at night. And the lights were off in the room except the one light that I had to read by. And it was my dad's birthday, and I had a card that I was preparing to send to him. And I was doing it. I actually wrote the words, and I thanked him, and I've been so very glad that I did. Because I told him that in all of the challenges that we have had with trust and having to trust God in very, very, very hard circumstances, and seeing our children suffer and things that we could not understand, we could not make sense out of it. But I could trust in my Heavenly Father, even when I didn't understand, because I had an earthly father that I knew I could trust. It was much easier for me. I have been given that gift of trust, because there are many people who have to learn trust. And I was gifted trust because I automatically could look at my Heavenly Father and say, Lord, I do not understand this. And I would tell the Lord, I don't understand. Couldn't we be much more effective for the kingdom of God if we weren't dealing with this? If we weren't spending days in the hospital, if our prayers and our emotions and our life wasn't consumed with survival for our children, and if our dining room table was not being piled stack upon stack of medical bills, couldn't we be much more effective? So if I didn't have an answer, I still just knew that I could trust him because I was gifted trust, and I'm very thankful for that. But I will say, for those that were not gifted trust, and many were not gifted because they have not had an earthly father who was an example of our Heavenly Father. But you can trust in your Heavenly Father, and the Lord can help refocus and shape and help you see our Heavenly Father for who he is, who wants to do good gifts and who is there. And he is not the source. I remember one time having someone come into the hospital, and when Jonathan was diagnosed with leukemia, after we had gone through years of all of that with you, it was a surreal experience. And I remember someone from the hospital, I think it was actually one of the hospital volunteers that came in one time, and they looked at me and they said, I don't understand. How can you trust in a God that could allow these things to happen? And I said, but it's because you don't understand that God did not cause this to happen. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. There's sin and sickness in this world, not because God, it's because of fallen brokenness in this world. There's sin in this world. So we're all a part of that. And I think learning to grasp that and to realize that he is there and that we can trust in him. And if we'll put our trust in him, and it is that trust that helps take us to our knees, and know that even if we don't hear an answer, faith is the substance of things not seen, that we trust that he is working, as the song says, even when I don't see it.
Unless you're living under a rock, you're aware that free speech is under assault right now. Big tech is increasingly censoring religious programming and making it hard for Christians' voices to have a digital platform. I predict this problem is going to worsen as time goes on. That's why I'm asking you to consider supporting this podcast on a monthly basis. You can financially support us by giving as little as 99 cents a month, or you can give $4.99 or $9.99 a month. Just go to www.anchor.fm/apostolic voice/support. That link is in the show notes on the device you're using to listen right now, and you should be able to just click the link and it will take you where you need to go. Thank you to everyone who's already done so. Also, please consider giving Apostolic Voice a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. They're the big ones, and they are screening religious programming, sometimes even hiding reviews and rankings. However, if we flood them with reviews, it's more difficult for them to deny our request to post them. Also, keep sharing on social media, and let's be unashamed of our faith, even in the big tech realm. Thank you for listening and lifting us up in prayer. God bless. I know that you and I and Dad and our whole family, we're careful not to label every sickness or every physical problem as a spiritual attack, because we know life happens. We know that we have finite bodies. We know that we're not promised to live forever in this world. And like you just said a moment ago, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. But we've had many conversations over the years. It did feel like in those days to us, and even in the future, I even look at the cancer that you went through and just some of the other strange things that have happened to our family. It does seem like the enemy attacked our family physically. And we know that that's biblically possible, because certainly Job was attacked physically. Right. Would you say that there was a spiritual element? I know we don't want to over-spiritualize or overstate it, but do you feel like there was a spiritual attack incorporated in some of the things, especially in those early days that our family had to go through?
Yes, we became very much aware of that. And I think that also drove my prayers into fighting against that attack. I said it's like you recognize the handprint of the enemy, and we became an awareness. There were so many things that happened. Not only did we have the very major situations that some people never experience, and that is your heart surgeries. And so for 6 years, we had 4 open heart surgeries for you. There were 2 times that you were scheduled for surgery that they canceled at the morning of. And the reason that's significant is because from a mother and parent standpoint and grandparent standpoint, I've had 6 nights that I laid awake knowing that the next morning we may walk as far as the operating room, and they would let us go, follow the cart with you and go as far to the doors. And they would open the doors and you would go in. We had one morning that the surgeon said, he called us out with the cardiologist. We were waiting for them to come and take you for surgery. And we had one morning that the surgeon took us to a conference room and he said, I can drive a car going 240 miles an hour, but I wouldn't do it unless I have to. And I can operate on Ryan today. But these muscle bundles that are in his heart that we are having to shave away right now, one of the things that we're having to do in the surgery, they are within millimeters of his coronary artery. And if we nick that artery, it's fatal. So I could do it today, but I don't think we have to do it today. It's your choice. Well, what do?
Yeah.
You go back to the room and you pack your bags and you go home. But only to have the cardiologist then consult with you and say, it has to be done.
Now, I want to put this in perspective for people who don't know your story and the history, I think maybe we're taking it for granted that some people understand, but you and Dad moved to Wheaton, which is a suburb of Chicago, to start a church. Right. Dad also entered into a college program. Was he starting his master's degree at Wheaton College at that time, or was he still in a bachelor program?
In from his Bible school and another college, and he was completing his bachelor's degree there.
So the master's program came later, but he started a really intense program at Wheaton College, starting a church from scratch, and you had moved from all friends and family. So it wasn't like you had, your mom and dad or any other family there with you. And then just 5-6 months in after that. So was I born, you said earlier, I was born, 5 months after you moved to Wheaton?
Right. We moved the day after Christmas, and you were born April the 20th. And so...
So at that point, it was just about a month later that all the intense medical issues began to happen.
We found out, and you had your first surgery at 2 months of age.
So, and you and Dad really were, when I think back, you were both extremely young at that time.
Well, we were in our mid-20s, and so compared to what we are now, that's very young.
Well, I think for most people, that's incredibly young to have all of those things happening at the same time. So it really was intense for people that don't understand, and then you're facing all of this. Now, I want to just kind of shift gears and ask you, and this is a story that if you've heard Dad preach very many times, you've probably heard him mention this story. He talks about going to a meeting, a church service, and he was in the altar and he was praying, and I don't remember if this particular story was when Jonathan was sick or me, but somebody came up to Dad in the altar and said something along the lines of, if you just had faith for your son, he wouldn't be sick right now. I might be getting the story a little bit wrong.
That's correct, yes.
And I know that devastated Dad. I mean, he still mentions it to this day.
Well,
and
it was devastating at that time.
Yeah, and it would be. And he uses it as an example, of course, of exactly what you shouldn't do to people who are hurting, who are in the midst of major
friendly fire.
Yes, that's friendly fire, and it's just a perfect example of what not to do to people. And the sad thing is that individual, I don't even know who it was, but that individual probably was not intending to be ugly, even though they were. And I know that you've seen this a lot. I've definitely seen this in my life. Anyone who's ever had any major hurt or pain or difficulty in their life knows what it's like to have someone that ought to be helping them hurt them in some way. And so because of that, I thought maybe you could just give just a little bit of advice to people who might know someone who's grieving or hurting or struggling through no fault of their own.
Right.
And maybe give them a little kind, loving advice on how to help reach out to people who are struggling.
I look back on myself and I see times that I probably misspoke, never intentional. So I know that there were people that spoke into our lives at times that it was very painful, that they didn't realize how painful words can be, because the implication that their words gave, what they were implying with that was not really what their heart intended to say. But when you are dealing with a situation that's life or death or whatever, and if somebody says, if you only have faith, I remember your dad coming home and going to me saying, my faith. Where is it in the Bible that says my faith? I had enough faith to move my family here with no support.
Right.
I had faith. We've evangelized, we've worked for the kingdom. I have faith. And so when they're saying that, they're implying that if my son is not healed, it is because I have a lack of faith. So that's the way those words were perceived. I can go even, and this was from somebody that was not an apostolic, but that was in the claim it and name it doctrine.
Yeah.
And it was a sister of
the Blab It Grab It group.
Yes, exactly right. And a sister that was of a new convert that we had, and she looked at me to my face and said, well, Christians don't have children with heart conditions.
Mm.
And so now that was stunning to me that someone could be that callous. But the ones that really hurt were people that looked and said, if you only have faith. And I think probably the best thing to do during times like that, and I've learned probably through even misspeaking myself through the years, that many times it's not always that you can say anything but I'm here and I care and I'm praying for you. I don't understand the reasons, but I know that we can trust in God. I think just sometimes being there, I know that for myself many times, it's like the old song that says, I give you Jesus. I'll pray for you. I know that I can't fix it, but I care. Sometimes I think those are the best things. And just to let them know that that God is there, even when you can't see it. He is there. He is working. If you don't mind, I'd like to go back just a moment, though, to about the spiritual attack, because that was a very real time. And it is true that there are many things that happen to us. Every time we get a flat tire, the devil didn't do it.
Right, right.
Every time, we get a cold, so that's very, very real. But there was that season of time. And I do believe this. I do believe that ministry families, now other families are too, children of God that are serving God, that are really impacting the kingdom. There are times, just like Job, that they come under an attack, that God says he's going to allow some certain things. But, he's always there, and that's the important thing. He's there. But when I realized that, it did change my prayers. But so we had your situation, and then we had Jonathan's situation. So you were 8 years old. The night that the very summer you were facing the potential of having a fifth open heart surgery. So at that time we had Jonathan, who was 2, and Nathan was 6 months old. And so we had our 3 sons. And we were in Connecticut, and you had flown to Connecticut with us, and Brother Billy Cole was doing the camp meeting. Connecticut camp was held at a Rhode Island college campus in the summer. And so during the daytime, they had youth camp, and we were younger, and Dad was the youth camp speaker. But at night, we would be in the camp meeting with Brother Billy Cole. I'm sure you remember that experience that summer.
I do, yeah.
It was a neat summer. You had a leak around a patch in your heart, the lower chambers of the heart. You had a patch, but you had multiple things with your heart that had to be corrected. So when we say open heart surgery for you, it was open heart surgery.
Right.
So we were there, and in the evening service, the Lord spoke to your dad one night in those powerful services with Brother Billy Cole. And the Lord spoke to him and said, Ryan is okay. I've taken care of that problem. Ryan will not have another surgery. And as time went on, when we got back and when we were able, that was true. We went in, the leak was gone. You did not have to have a fifth. We saw a miracle. We had prayed for many miracles. God had been there, but you'd had many surgeries, but you did not have to have that fifth surgery.
It was miraculous.
It was miraculous. They had said a fifth, but we didn't have to have that. But that very meeting that the Lord spoke to your dad, we got a call from my parents that Jonathan started limping. And that started the process of us getting back and then getting into our doctor, and then the absolutely stunning diagnosis within just a few days that Jonathan had leukemia. And when they discovered it, it was a Wednesday night after church. I was home with him because he was not sick. And I just want to tell an spiritual experience that I had, because God does things. He doesn't always take it away, but he prepares us. And that day I had this concern. Now, listen, I've had concerns that never came to pass. So sometimes it's hard to know if this, like a feeling that you have, is fear or whether God is preparing you.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
But that day, in my mind, out of nowhere, I thought, Jonathan has leukemia. I cannot tell you why. I did not know anybody with leukemia. Jonathan did not present the way normally people do with leukemia, but it was so strong that I went and told your dad. I voiced it. I said, I'm afraid Jonathan has leukemia.
Wow.
I still do not know. And he looked at me and says, no, that can't be. But that night, when he got in from Bible study and you got in with your dad, we got the call and they literally told us, we have just got results back. Jonathan has leukemia. We had not even heard them. We had no idea that was even in the consideration of what his situation was. And they were waiting for us at Children's Memorial. So that was a very surreal experience. But during that time, we had so many other strange things that would happen. I mean, it was just we knew it was a spiritual attack. So I believe that, Satan does want to come, and he was coming against our family, because what will impact and can make someone ineffective or paralyze them more than when you're completely overwhelmed with those types of things. And so, for an example, and we could go on, but just so many weird things. But one of the unique things is at one point, in this span of years that it was so intense, is your dad and Jonathan both had their appendix out within 24 hours of each other.
Yeah, I remember that. Very, very strange things.
Very strange things. And so it wasn't so, and our doctor, we had a wonderful family doctor who was a Christian, and he was wonderful. He was wonderful. And he looked at us with like, y'all have no underlying health issues. Dad and I didn't, but we would have hospitalizations. I was hospitalized one time for 18 days for a surgery that went wrong. I mean, we had just major crazy things. But, during those times when I recognized at the hand of the enemy, we fought on our knees for our family.
Yeah. I know in my life, I look back and I wouldn't change. Josh Michael was on, and Josh, he's the fourth French brother. And
yes.
You love Josh.
Oh, I love Josh.
And
I was there at the hospital with him.
After he was wounded. And, he said something that I thought was really, really powerful at the end of our podcast episode together. I asked him if you could go back and tell Josh, younger Josh, one thing you could change about life, maybe something that would save you some pain. And he said, I don't think I would change anything. He said, the problem I have with that question is that that implies that the pain was bad. And I thought that was a really good answer, because everything that we go through shapes us. It really is true that God takes what the devil intended for evil, and he really does turn it around for our good. And sometimes we don't see the good of it until way down the road in life, and maybe sometimes we never even fully recognize it in this lifetime. But I know for me, I think of the health issues that I had as a child, and that has shaped me. It shaped my faith. A lot of the faith that I've had as an adult started to grow and germinate as a child in the hospital, when I had no choice but to trust God.
Right.
And of course, it's all in how you respond to things. We know that. But I was in a home, in a family that taught me how to respond properly to pain, that taught me that trained me to put my faith in God. But I look at my adult life, and for example, in ministry, I have empathy for people who are sick and people who are hurting in ways that I don't think that I would have had otherwise.
Right.
I can go into a hospital situation, and I have many hundreds of times, and I can relate and feel an empathy for them and that situation, and also have faith for them at the same time.
Right.
And so it's helped me in many ways as a minister, and helped me have faith in other areas of my life as well. Are you able to look at those things, even your own sicknesses and battling cancer twice? Are you able to affirm that to where you see in your own ministry even how God has used it to help you be better than you would have been otherwise?
I said many times, you would never ask for those things. Who would ask for hardship?
Of course not.
But I see changes in me. I learned to praise the Lord in a way. It changed me. I was loved the Lord from a child. I received the Holy Ghost when I was 7 years old, and I always wanted to serve the Lord. I never had a desire to do anything but to please the Lord and to serve the Lord. But my personality is I'm an introvert. I'm reserved. And so while my worship was always sincere, there were changes that took place. I learned where my strength came from, and it changed the whole dynamic. We went to hear, I had the opportunity to hear Sister Nona Freeman, during some really difficult times. And it was a life-changing experience that many people would have sat there and it did not impact them the same way as it did me, because my need was so great. I had such a great need at that time. And she talked about our worship and how we praise the Lord in everything. And I remember determining that I was going to praise the Lord, no matter if I had been at the hospital room and I had until late the night before. And there were many times that we were in a hospital room till late on a Saturday night, and I would be up in the night giving John a rescue medication during the night because he had to have a rescue drug because the chemo was breaking down the DNA. I mean, it was a big deal. And if he was well enough, we were faithful, and I was there the next morning. It depended, and we never endangered our children's health. But regardless of the circumstances, I knew for my health, and I came through, and I would learn to praise Him. And so, while my nature might be reserved, I got to the place that, you know what, it was me and God, and I wasn't really worried about everybody around me. I didn't worry that if my face looked pretty or not, if I was weeping before the Lord or praising the Lord. I didn't worry how my voice sounded. I didn't worry about it. It was me and God. I learned a dimension of worship and praise. There are so many things that I learned. And yes, empathy. There, it's like, and faith and trust that this next thing, it's like exercising your spiritual muscles. If I can go through this pain, and I think that's what happened to me when I had the cancer. I mean, honest to goodness, that was a difficult time. But, when I was diagnosed with cancer, I mean, my concern was my family and all. But, I looked at it and thought, my goodness, when I was going through the treatment, and it was very difficult. My first bout with cancer was very difficult. And the chemo it ravaged me. It was difficult. But at that point, I was like, you know what? After what my boys have been through, I can do this. I can handle this.
It's amazing how God brings you through things where you say, well, you know what, if God could bring me through that, God can bring me through anything.
Right. It's just, it's different. And I really do think my experience with cancer was different than somebody who had never experienced things before, because it's like, I've been here, done this. We got through this. God is here, And so it was hard. Oh, yes, it was hard. It wasn't easy. But, I just didn't sit around and having to evaluate. I'd been through all those things before. I knew where my trust was. I knew that I needed to praise Him. I knew that I could be in the will of God and still be facing challenging things, And
you had settled those things a long time ago.
And so those things are building blocks, in our faith. And so, they apply to other areas in our life too.
I want to switch gears just a little bit. You and Dad have a beautiful and strong marriage. And I want to make this kind of a two-part question. I want to go back in time and ask you about your younger days in marriage, specifically during the sicknesses and young pastors and pastor's wife and all of the financial struggles that went along with that. But I also want to move forward to where we are right now and ask you to give some advice to young, middle-aged married couples. Your early years of marriage, I think, were much more stressful probably than, now I know for young married couples, it's always stressful. There's just the stress of learning to be married and the stress of learning to be on your own and all of those things, finding your way and path in life. But you had a lot of unusual stress on you in those early days. I know at one point, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I think I've heard Dad say at one point there was $1 million in unpaid medical bills. I know insurance problems. People can imagine the insurance difficulties that would go along with all of that. Can you give some advice? Go back to when you were young and all of that was happening. Maybe speak to a young married couple that might be going through some intensely difficult things right now, and just give them some quick marriage advice?
Well, first, let me say it's hard. There's no sense in trying to sugarcoat it and make it seem like it's just a piece of cake. It's not. It's very difficult. That's one of the things, when you have any kind of health issues, the financial, it's like, oh my goodness, if I'm going to pay all this money, don't I get benefit? But it's, you get your life is what happens, or you get your children.
Yeah.
So the stress of financial, was huge. But I'll say this: faithfulness. When you're faithful and you give of your tithes, even when you don't know where you're going to be able to take care of other needs, and you stay faithful. Faithfulness in small things, faithfulness in just being consistent, and prayerfulness. And so those were difficult times, but, we were truly committed to each other. I mean, there's one thing we knew above, life was hard, but we were in it together. Okay. So we were pulling in the same direction, and we prayed. I'd like to say we had miracles happen. There were many miracles that happened. And let me tell you that if you are serving the Lord, and if you are, now when people live above their means, sometimes there's consequences. You reap what you sow. You have to, and God will help you. But when you have things that are completely beyond your control, you can say, now, Lord, I need your help and guidance. And, we saw miracles happen. I remember one time when Jonathan was very, very sick, and we needed a new car, and we were trying to get a new car just before that happened. And then he got very sick, and life got so crazy, and we had an absolute miracle happen out of nowhere to us. We drove home, and I know you remember the blue van.
Oh yeah. And
that blue van came in our driveway, and we never was even given all the details. We know that it was not just one person. Some of it was our church people. I think probably my dad and other ministers in our area that all came together. It wasn't brand new, but it looked like brand new. And it was keys given to us, and it was completely paid for. Incredible miracles.
It might as well have been a Mercedes-Benz to our family.
Oh, listen, it was an absolute wonderful miracle. And there were other times that we were faithfully trying to find ways to pay medical bills. And I mean, we had so many, you know how it is when you have that many hospitalizations, and you have an anesthesiologist for this and all. So, I mean, it's stacked. And you literally look at it, and it is Mount Everest. It was. I'm saying it was. But I'm going to tell you, just the fact that God brought us through that has built my faith, that when I face something and I worry and I trouble over it, I remember when. But God, you took care of that. Because I remember a time that we were trying to find out, how can we pay this much to each one and still put food on the table? Can we spend $10 to this one or $5? I mean, it was that bad. Monthly, just trying to say, how can we tackle these medical bills?
We did a lot of Taco Bell.
We did a lot of Taco Bell.
Yeah.
Also did vacations where we had a big change jar, and we would say, do you want McDonald's or do you want to go on vacation? And so,
yeah,
but there were precious memories,
absolutely.
Were good memories. But I remember a time that your dad called about one medical bill that we were trying to make sure we had the final total on it so we could try to make those arrangements, and they couldn't find it. And
so they dropped it.
They forgave it.
Yeah.
And they called back the next day and they said, we found it. But because we forgave it, it's forgiven.
Yeah, amen. Wow.
It was a miracle. So do everything that you can during those times those times can be very heavy. I think in relationships, there's going to be one time that somebody is overwhelmed, because real life can be overwhelming. And so I think that sometimes Dad and I would switch roles. One would be the encourager while the other one was overwhelmed.
I was just about to say, I was too young during, my health issues to really have been able to pay attention to how you and Dad were responding. But when John had leukemia, I have vivid memories. And I think that I remember observing exactly what you just said. It seemed like the Lord did it for you and Dad, where when he was really, really down, your faith would be high.
Right.
And you were able to help him. And and then maybe you would be really, really down, and then Dad's faith would be high and he'd be able to help you. And sometimes you would just kind of take turns lifting one another up.
Right. Exactly right. Sometimes one is giving 100% while the other one has nothing left to give. It's back and forth, but
I read somewhere recently, a lot of people say marriage is 50-50, and this book was challenging that notion, the idea that, sometimes it's 80-20, sometimes it's and then it goes the other way. It's like sometimes you're giving 80% and they're giving 20, and then it reverses. Do you think that's a truism? Do you think that's real?
I know it is. It is a truism. And I'll even go further in our experience. For instance, when I had cancer and I was very sick and very, very weak, your dad was giving 100% at that time.
Oh, yeah.
He was. It was definitely a time. And then there have been other times that in his that I was having to give more. And so it's a back and forth. It's not 50-50. And I think a lot of times marriages suffer because people think it's that way, but it's not. It's taking care of the need that's there.
Yeah, don't you think that 50-50 mindset has done a lot of damage to marriages?
Damage. There's no such thing as 50-50. And it can fluctuate day by day.
Right. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And season by season. Sometimes you go through extended seasons where, you might be giving more out of necessity or even just because that's what's best at that moment.
And, I think our society has the mentality of our society, the me generation is very, we live in a very selfish society. And I think that's one thing that hurts marriages because they say, well, I'm giving too much. Well, that's part of the deal.
Right.
That's part of the deal. And it's to till death do we part.
I read somewhere else recently that the key to marriage, and really in many ways to relationships in general in life, is selflessness. You mentioned earlier, we really do. We live in the iPhone generation where it's it's me, it's the iPhone, the iPad, the iPods. And it almost subliminally we're programmed or conditioned to put ourselves first. And the mantra of our culture, follow your heart, and all of those kind of things that are kind of selfishly motivated philosophies push us in our marriages to bring that into our relationship. And so much of what you're saying, it really just comes down to a selflessness that says, I'm going to love even when it's hard. I'm going to sacrifice when it's hard. I'm going to lift the load even when it seems unfair. Is that fair to say? Do you think that's
I think that's exactly right. We're called to be Christ-like. And was there anyone more unselfish than our Lord?
Right.
He laid down his life. And so, but selfless relationships do blossom. Really, for a relationship, you cannot always be thinking of yourself. You really have to start to consider your brother or your sister or your husband. And it's very, very important, selflessness.
Or your children.
Nothing
makes you more selfless than children and grandchildren.
Oh, exactly right.
If you're doing it correctly.
If you're doing it correctly, exactly right.
I know one of the questions that you get all the time is about parenting and now about grandparenting even. But your three sons all serve the Lord, myself, yeah. Jonathan, and Nathan. And I know you give God the credit for that, and you certainly don't feel arrogant about it. But you did a remarkable job raising your sons through very difficult times, as we've already mentioned. And I know a lot of people ask you, what are some tips? I want my children, I want my boys, I want my daughters to serve the Lord. I know as a parent with my two children, that's my daily heartbeat. What can I do? I want my kids to serve the Lord. I want them to love the Lord. Maybe you could just talk. I know there's not a one size fits all. I know there's not a silver bullet. And you and I also know, we've talked about this before. We know wonderful people who have selflessly raised their children and done everything in their power to put their children on the right track, and they've gone down the wrong track. And that doesn't mean that they were bad parents or that they did something terribly wrong. And so we're not approaching this conversation flippantly or arrogantly. Maybe you could give some parenting tips.
I thank the Lord daily. I'm so thankful and so grateful that my sons are walking in truth and their families are all walking in truth. And I'm so very thankful for that. But I do feel very humble about that. And like you say, there's no arrogance there because I know that the enemy fights families and in particular ministry families because he knows what more could harm and hurt a minister's heart, and all is to give their life for the kingdom and then their children not to walk in truth. So there are a lot of voices and other impacts. And so I do thank the Lord. I also know my own imperfections and shortcomings. And sometimes I think, oh, it's by the grace of God, because I certainly didn't have perfection in everything that I did. But I do know that from the very beginning, your dad and I, it was a passion. It was an intentional thing from the very beginning, is to make sure that we really worked very hard and diligently just from the very beginning. I remember specifically during times that you and Jonathan were very, very sick and very young and very sick. And I would pray and I would beseech the Lord and I would pray for deliverance and I would pray for healing. But I remember even then praying and saying, Lord, if in your foreknowledge you know that they're not going to serve you, I will grieve the rest of my life. And I don't know how I will handle that grief. I've never walked down that road before, but I would rather grieve the rest of my life. So Lord, take them now if you see that.
Yeah.
Because that's how intense our burden was to make sure that we could try to do. So we were intentional. And so I think as far as some of the things that we really did try to implement is that we really did try to guard your lives. And I can look back and see the areas that I probably incidents that I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't guard that well at that time. In hindsight, you can. But, as the world got worse, you realize you had to guard more. But, we really did try to guard the influences in your life, the types of friends that you would have. We tried to be very intentional. Ours was definitely a home where we worked hard to know where you were, where all of y'all were. I don't think that our home was overly restrictive, but it was definitely a home of accountability, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember, I'll get ages wrong. My memory these days has just gotten terrible. But, I was in my teens. I had to have been in my teens. We were in Indianapolis at that time. So, I mean, I might have even been 20. I don't know. But I had a curfew. I mean, as long as I lived at home, I had a curfew. If I lived at home, I had to give accountability for where I was going to be and what I was going to be doing. And I broke curfew a few times. Yes. And I remember coming home extremely late, thinking I would just slip up to my room, and you and Dad were sitting downstairs. Oh, yes. Very sleepy and very concerned and also very angry. And, I didn't like it then. I didn't like it then. Certainly not. And I don't think I was doing anything bad.
No, there was never a time. I'm very blessed. I never ever had a time that I even actually worried that my sons were doing something wrong.
But you know what, Mom, I can look back and realize that the reason that I didn't really feel liberty or even strong temptation to do things wrong that maybe I otherwise would have been tempted to do as a young person was because I knew I was going to come home, and if I had done something wrong, y'all were going to figure it out. You were going to figure it out. You were going to search until you figured out why the puzzle pieces weren't fitting, And so that saved me a lot of times because I might have felt the temptation to do something, but I knew, hey, Mom and Dad are going to figure this out.
Yes, there was accountability. And even though we really did trust you, y'all, we did trust, but there was accountability. And even as you got older, it would be, when you're living in our home, this mom doesn't rest until I know everybody's safe. Now, when you're married and you're gone, that's different. But, you're in this home, of course, because y'all were in your home when you were still single. So, even as you're older, when there's dating and all, there needs to be accountability. and even with friends. So we had accountability. We were very, very intentional. We tried to be very intentional. It was really important to us to, when we said no, and we did say no, but we wanted to say yes as many times as we can. So we didn't love to say no. We weren't the parents that just loved to say no. But if we said, no, we're not doing that, or you're not doing this, or you're not watching that, or you're not going there was a reason. It wasn't just like I said no, and that's the reason. I want to tell you the reason for no.
You were really intentional about giving the reasons why we weren't allowed to do certain things.
Right.
This may or may not be interesting to people listening. I don't know, but it's a vivid memory in my childhood / very young teens. You and Dad were raised listening to, I don't know. I mean, I know that you loved Southern gospel.
Dad was even more Southern gospel than me, actually.
Yes, Dad liked Southern gospel. Dad even liked bluegrass for a time. He went through a little bit of a bluegrass phase there. I don't know. I guess your influence was more.
I was of the early Jackson era, and the Lonnie Wolf era really impacted me. And then I was a Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir lover. And
yes, yeah, y'all.
Harris and yeah.
And music was a big part of our lives growing up. I mean, you played piano in the church. I don't even know how you did it with everything going on, but you played piano and Dad sang, and it was starting a church. You do everything. And so I grew up loving music and being musical. And I have this memory, and I know you do as well. I started liking more contemporary Christian music, and thinking back, it's almost funny to me, but it was a big deal at the time. I got into Stephen Curtis Chapman. I really like Stephen Curtis Chapman's music, and now he seems like, tame and mild as can possibly be. But back then he came out with an album called Signs of Life, and it just stylistically, not lyrically, but stylistically, it was very modern and a little on the rocky side, very different from what was typically played in our house. And I got the tape, for goodness sake. I remember how long ago that was.
Yes.
And I was playing a song, and I don't remember, we were in the car, maybe you heard it, and you just did not like it. It didn't strike you well.
I believe it was the Lord of the Dance.
It was the song Lord of the Dance.
I actually was taking offense to, I didn't understand the lyrics, what he was even trying to say. I was thinking, yes, go ahead, yes.
And I think it was more than that, too. I think even just the style of it, everything. You put it all together, it was just, you did not like it.
No.
You felt like it was ungodly.
I was very strong, in my opinion.
Very strong. I mean, this wasn't a mild conversation. I mean, you were very upset. And I was just crushed by it because I loved it, and I'm trying to understand, what's wrong with this? Do I have to listen to Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir? Is that all I'm allowed to listen to? And we had this long back and forth about it, and it was kind of a strange turning point, I think, because you weren't going to compromise, and you never have compromised. But you were in that moment willing as a parent to say, okay, I need to think about why I don't like this. Do I not like it for legitimate spiritual or biblical reasons, or do I just not like it myself? And I've always really respected that about you and Dad, that eventually you were able to see, okay, I don't like this personally, but there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, actually, I began to love Steve Curtis Chapman.
Yes. Oh, well, that's a whole nother story. Yeah, which is incredible when I think back about it. That impacted me as a young person because I realized you weren't just making rules based on your preferences. If you had a rule or if you said no to something, it really was because you had a biblical or spiritual undergirding to that opinion. And you weren't going to just fight over your preferences. And do you remember that? Does that stand out in your mind?
Very vivid memory. I remember exactly where we were. We were in the Donata area of Wheaton, and we had just gone to the family bookstore. And you were, I mean,
a highlight of my childhood, by the way.
It was a highlight. It was a big deal, and it was just you and I, and that probably didn't happen all the time either because you had two younger brothers, and it was a fun time, and I remember that very vividly. You putting that on and me getting my righteous indignation on, and really just started in on it. And I remembered you very respectfully very respectfully, and I believe you were about probably 14 years old. I remember you looking at me and saying, and this wasn't a common thing for you either, you actually had tears in your eyes. And you looked at me and you said, okay, Mom, I don't want to do wrong. If this is wrong, tell me what's wrong about it. And that's literally took my breath away. And I had to stop my tirade, just stop this. Oh, well, my goodness, what, and all. It's like, I've seen this in myself, and I recognize that we have to be thoughtful because I see people compromise. I had seen friends compromise. I'm not going to be a compromiser.
Right.
But if we're not careful, we can let our fear of compromise actually not make us be thoughtful. And probably at that moment, it was like, I've got to make sure. So I think that was an important part. And I do believe that your dad and I both tried. I think that's a very important thing. Even in my imperfections, and we're showing my imperfection there. Certainly I didn't start the conversation right. But I was able to stop back and listen. And we had a conversation about it. And we thought it through and we worked through it. And
I actually think it's the opposite. I actually think that it doesn't show your imperfection. I think it shows really a strength that you were able to pivot without compromising, but recognize something and pivot, even though it was uncomfortable for you. And that's hard. That's hard sometimes for parents to do. Now, of course, we see the opposite end of the spectrum, where sometimes parents go the other direction and they just have an anything goes mentality.
Right.
And that's very, very dangerous.
And I've seen that happen. And I think probably for us, we had seen that happen. And we had seen churches and ministries greatly impacted because they held it strong until their children came along.
Sure.
Dad and I were determined that not only did we value truth, we valued our children, and we wanted our children to be saved. I think, that goes into, there's some things that we really did do because we did seek to try to help our understanding about raising children by reading. I was we called James Dobson, y'all would call him Brother Dobson around the house. Because,
yeah, we sure did.
Always listening to focus on the family or reading how to raising boys, or The Strong-Willed Child, or we were reading The Birth Order by, was that Lehman or Smalley? I think it's Smalley. I just different ones. I was doing everything I could to try to have an understanding of and even temperaments, trying to understand, that's part of relationship in anything, in a marriage, but also in your children, to try to understand, because every child is different. And, somebody that has a very mild-mannered child or complacent child, they think they have parenting down. We had one dear sister who did that. Her first child was just she was just a very easy child.
What a blessing.
And she thought she had the parenting thing, and she saw everybody else that was struggling with, a 2-year-old tantrum or things like that, until her second one came along. And then it's the reality is that, there's developmental stages. And, and that's another thing I think as a parent, I really do think it's important to try to understand what takes place in the development. In the 2-year-olds and all those things, what's taking place in their development that causes certain and how to try to react properly. You were raised in a pastor's home, but this is pastors, saints alike. But, faithfulness, we made sure that your lives revolved around the things of the Lord, and I know that sometimes people get their kids involved in a lot of outside extracurricular things, and they think that that's making them, and I'm not saying that all of that is harmful, but, our choice was not to do that. Our choice was to have y'all involved in, things that involved, the house of the Lord. If you played, y'all weren't in little leagues and things like that would pull your attention away or try to get you away from, so we could go out and do visitation on Saturdays instead of being out on the ball field on Saturday mornings.
Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Like, so, our lives revolved around the things of God. Even I remember, and of course this was Brother Dobson. James Dobson said one time, try to help your child find one thing that they're really good at to help build their confidence.
Yes, and I want to just pause and tell parents out there, listeners, that this really is, I know what Mom's about to say, and this really is profound, and I can say in my own life, this is extremely true. So I interrupted you. I'll let you go ahead.
It impacted me when I read it. And so because we were ministry and we were, all of our family loved music, you had other interests, the boys had interests, but everybody loved music. And so we first introduced you to, through a man in our church who was a guitarist, and you took guitar lessons, music lessons, and you became, even though you don't use that as much now with your ministry, but at one point it was a huge part of your life.
Oh, it was my identity for a long time.
Identity for a long time, and you became a gifted guitarist. And then you, in turn, taught your younger brother. And I remember the Christmas when Jonathan and Nathan were 9 and 11, and we bought a guitar for them. And you started guitar lessons for Nathan. And Nathan started developing his musical gifts. And we can see where that's now. Yeah,
absolutely.
Rachel. And so, a songwriter and musician, and his music has certainly continues to play a big part. And then Josh Michael. So John really, his interest was more toward the bass. And so Josh Michael is the one who taught Jonathan. And then Jonathan grew and is an outstanding guitarist, and even has played, on recordings for Nathan and Rachel. And is our bass player, and would even have more venues open for him if he chose to with his gifts. So, but that brought an ability to incorporate something that you loved into worship. It opened doors for you, and it helped build confidence. And so, it may not be, every family is not gifted or bent toward music. It can be, but I do believe it's important that you try to help someone find something that they can find an area that would grow, that would be ministry. Right now there's so many things in a church. If you have a child who's very gifted towards photography, my goodness, our media team always needs someone that can help run a camera, or, someone that's gifted with graphics and computer, or on and on and on.
Oh, there's so many areas, but if a child or a young person, especially in the teen years, if they can find that one thing that they're very good at, and passionate about and interested in, and it's even better if they can find a way to incorporate that in their local church. If they can find that, it gives them a confidence moving forward. I know when I was in my senior year of high school, or just before it, we moved from Wheaton to Indianapolis. That's a long story. Dad went to Indiana Bible College to be dean of theology, and then eventually became the vice president. That was very disconcerting for me, because I had to leave everything that I was comfortable with at a pivotal time in my life, and go to from a comparatively a very small home missions church to one of the biggest churches in the country. And I went from being the pastor's son to just a kid in the youth group, And if it hadn't been for the guitar and my passion for that, and what that did, like you said, it gave me opportunities to connect with people and to involve myself. I really feel like I probably would have been lost in the shuffle in many ways if it hadn't been for that. Young people need that. There's no doubt about it. If you could sit down for 2 minutes with young Rebecca, go back in time, what advice would you give her? What would you say to encourage her?
Well, that's a really, as Grandpa Smith, my dad, would have said, that's a mighty deep question there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When I look back, I still believe in the premise that we had, in the direction that we had. And I think if I could go back, I mean, redos would be wonderful to redo. There's so many incidents that I would like to go back and maybe redo. But I think my premise was right. I would like to go back and redo things with more wisdom. Like I pray for wisdom, and I think in some areas I've gained wisdom, maybe more patience, but always with the same consistency and always with the same purpose and intent. So I don't think that I would redo the direction that we went. And even during the times that were hard, like for instance, times that were adjustment, when we were in God's will and there were changes that they were very hard, it's not that you can redo that, but I would just pray for more wisdom to be able to do things more perfectly or to do things better, to try to be more insightful, more prayerful. I would always say, my personality is this. Let me say it this way. My nature is to be a fixer. And I have gotten myself in more distress through the years trying to fix things.
Right.
I am a fixer. I want to, as a pastor's wife, through the years when people come to me with a challenge, I've had to learn to quieten that inner voice inside. How can I fix this? Because I have found that there can be so many things in life that I cannot do anything to fix.
So many times only God can fix it.
Only God can fix things. And so there's been times that I've wanted to fix things that maybe when I did it, I should have stepped back and let the master do it.
Well, that segues perfectly into another question, and we're almost completely moving away from everything we've talked about in terms of childhood and things. You've been a pastor's wife, 10 years here now in the Atlanta area, but you were a pastor's wife in the Chicago area for 10
years.
How many years?
17.
17 years. So that's 27 years of being a pastor's wife. And I know this is one of those questions that you probably feel like you have to dance around a little bit, but what do you wish saints understood about pastors' wives?
Oh, that's a really good question.
I know, for example, that I've written about this, and this is true, that pastors' wives are kind of a unique role in a church because we don't have a lot of biblical role models to look at, and it's an unpaid position that has tremendous responsibility and expectations placed on it. And you might even could look back to when you were a young pastor's wife, maybe expectations that are placed or things of that nature. What do you wish that saints could look at and say, I don't understand that, but I'd like to understand about my pastor's wife?
Well, I will have to say this to preface is that I really have been in the two congregations that we've been. I've had saints that were very precious to me.
Tremendous saints.
And so I have felt affirmed by saints. Now, I can't say that I could tell you certain incidents, but I'm talking overall generality. I feel very affirmed by our wonderful people here and our precious people in Wheaton. I just had a phone conversation for fairly lengthy with the first Bible study that I taught when we were in Wheaton just the other day. And
isn't that amazing?
And very precious. And so these people from Wheaton are still very, very dear to my heart. So I felt affirmation there too. But in general, I think as a pastor's wife is that, we all have our different giftings. Some pastors' wives struggle because maybe they're not gifted musically and people stereotype pastors' wives. And,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that can even change. And, that was a real big problem earlier. Sometimes it's like, you almost need to be tech savvy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or you need to be a great decorator, or you need to be this, or you need to be that, or you need to be a great teacher, or you need to be this. And every pastor's wife does not have the same giftings. I feel like that I've been where people have been gracious for my areas that I'm not as gifted, and then have allowed me to try to grow in the areas that I feel like that the Lord, does maybe have some areas that I can have some influence in. But I think probably one of the things is that pastors' wives are also wives, and they're also mothers. And so a pastor's wife, it does feel different for when you're going through struggles like we did. A pastor's wife will go into a service. She will, when she's going through difficult times.
You live in a glass house.
We live in a glass house. You can't always have the privacy of everything. And I'm basically am a private person. At times needing to guard your own emotions at times where you're maybe still be working through an issues. For instance, I talked about things that I had to work through in those early years about how I viewed hardships and God's. I wasn't a Jonah. We weren't a Jonah, and we were in the will of God and different things. You're working through things spiritually. You're growing too, and yet you do have to do it in a glass house, and you have to walk in, and you have to make sure that always that need of knowing that your saints are watching you and that you have a responsibility to never slip. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, morally slip or anything, but you need to try to always put your best foot forward, your best face forward. And that can be emotionally draining at times. So that can be challenging when difficult times come. But then there's also the benefit of that. Okay, so I say that there's also the time that it helps us grow stronger so we can do that.
Yeah.
And if we didn't feel that need, we would not push as hard. So I think I benefited from that, but it is also a process. And also, let me say, as a pastor's wife, the best thing that you can do for your pastor's wife is to love her family.
Yes.
Because if anything is ever negative against, she can even handle it about herself. Somebody may misspeak about her or say something. But if it's about her husband or if it's about her children, pastor's wife can't go. There's been times, that I've seen things and I thought, we could handle that if it was the saint's child. But because it's the pastor's child, we kind of have to step back and just let the Lord take care of it and hold our peace.
Mom, I want to close out with one final thing here. You had a tremendous brother, my Uncle David Smith, who he wasn't born handicapped. He was born healthy. And then he had a sickness and a fever that caused him to be mentally retarded for the rest of his life. And he passed away. Mom, forgive me, how many years ago now did Uncle David pass away? Are you able to remember?
I believe it was in 2006.
So, oh wow. So about 14 years ago, he passed away. But you were raised with a brother who had special needs, who was handicapped. That shaped your life in a lot of ways. In some ways, probably even prepared you for things that would happen later in life. And you saw people mistreat him and call him names and things like that. I just wanted to mention very quickly, as Christians, I know this is something that's near to your heart. We should have a love and a compassion and a concern, and certainly not be ugly or flippant or unkind towards people like that. I know as a child, there was kind of a common thing that people would say, and I even don't like to say it out loud, but people would call someone retarded, and that was an insult, or it was kind of a common insult that people would say, just being silly and thinking it was funny. That was always very offensive to our family, because if you had someone in your life who was retarded and you'd seen them made fun of legitimately, it's very, very hurtful. Could you speak to Christians who may not have a sensitivity to that and help them understand why that is so harmful and why we should be caring towards people that might have special needs?
Right. Thank you, Ryan. That's something that we don't hear addressed a lot. And yes, my childhood and my life was definitely shaped by having a very, very special brother. And I always looked for birthday cards that said my special brother, and what a joy he was. And yet there was many hardships and heartaches because of the frustration of the things that he could not do, that he desired to do. And my parents were heroes, truly godly, incredible people.
Genuine heroes. Genuine
heroes who not only looked after their needs of their handicapped child, but also did their very best to have the opportunities for their two daughters who had other needs too. And how they juggled it, I look at it amazement as a parent and as an adult, and how they made our childhood happy. And my mother, it was still a happy childhood, even though there were times that there was heartache and challenges. But I do remember very well being a child, and my brother was in special education in elementary school. And I remember the popular kid in my class, as my brother got into the car and I got in the car, and he stood behind the car and mimicked the awkward gait that my brother had as he walked, or the rocking that he would do in the car. And I was a very shy, introverted, But I was so angry that even though I could be shy, you didn't mess with my brother.
Right.
In fact, I was so determined that I was going to let it be known that he was my brother, that in elementary school, when the special education class would come in, I would leave my lunch area. It was not without permission, but I would leave and go back to see my brother and talk to the special education class. Well, the principal finally had to call my mother and said, it's very sweet that Rebecca wants to go back and see her brother and his friends, but it actually kind of gets the table a little disruptive and it makes it harder for the teachers. So could you please ask her to
Right.
But we did learn, from a very young age, not only but anybody, to learn empathy and compassion, because we had the inside story. We saw, while there were joys and unconditional love, we saw the heartache and the pain and the trials. And so if somebody was mentally handicapped, we didn't have fun at their expense. If somebody was they were deaf, or somebody that was blind, or someone had an awkward gait. And, that's Christ-like. And it's amazing to me how Christians, and I know many times that's because they have not put thought into it. They're not intentional. They don't measure their thoughts and their actions, and it can be upbringing. But I do believe as Christians, it is very important to think about the people that you are ministering to, for us to try and not in many different areas. I'll take it to just a little another thing is I'm very conscious on Mother's Day that I have mothers out there that have longed for a child. And they may not have. So because of other experiences, I will say, I want all of our women, because God has given, there's somebody in your life that you are nurturing. And so we need to have a sensitivity. And so when it comes to those that are handicapped, that are that have misfortune and all, we should not be ridiculed. We should be Christ-like in our actions and realize that what incredible pain that words can cause for somebody that is living a life, that they have the inside story and they know all the hurts and the tears and the fears and the broken dreams that happen. And if we can have sensitivity, the hardest thing for my parents and for me as a child would be in a church service or a conference where there would be skits or little dramas that we're putting on, and one of them was portrayed and they were almost like a slow person, and everybody laughed. I remember my times that my parents had really great pain over that. And it grieved them. Within the church needs to be very conscious of those things as a Christian.
Absolutely. Well, Mom, thank you so much for being on Apostolic Voice. I love you and I appreciate you.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you very soon.
Okay. Thank you. Love you.